The first documented slaves in the United States in the territory that is now Georgia arrived in September of 1526. There were 100 of them. This colony was founded by Lucas Vasquez de Ayllon. A rebellion by the slaves resulted in the destruction of the colony within 2 months of forming, and the slaves fled to join indigenous groups as well as forming groups called the Maroons. The year 1619 is considered the formal beginnings of slavery in the United States, when 20 Africans were seized and brought to Jamestown. It is estimated that a rate of 30,000 people per year were transported in vessels to the U.S. The total number of Africans transported was 12 million, with approximately 11 million actually surviving the journey. By 1825, 25% of the U.S. population was of African descent, and these slaves would build the colonies through indentured and forced labor. It would take more than 200 years for America's debate over the ethics of slavery to culminate in a civil war. There were many precursors to the war, with one of those issues being the opposing views between free and slave states. While the abolition of slavery was an outcome of the war, it was not the initial goal of the war. The war between the North and the South was fought to prevent the Southern states from secession.
By the President of the United States of America. A proclamation. Whereas on the 22nd day of September, A.D. 1862, a proclamation was issued by the President of the United States containing, among other things, the following, to wit, that on the first day of January, A.D. 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. And the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons, and will do no act or acts to repress such persons, or any of them, in any efforts they may make for their actual freedom. That the executive will, on the first day of January aforesaid, by proclamation, designate the states and parts of states, if any, in which the people thereof, respectively, shall then be in rebellion against the United States, and the fact that any state or the people thereof shall on that day be in good faith represented in the Congress of the United States by members chosen thereto at elections, wherein a majority of the qualified voters of such states shall have participated, shall, in the absence of strong countervailing testimony, be deemed conclusive evidence that such state and the people thereof are not then in rebellion against the United States. Now, therefore, I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, by virtue of the power in me vested as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States, in time of actual armed rebellion against the authority and government of the United States, and as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion, do, on this first day of January A.D. 1863, and in accordance with my purpose to do so, publicly proclaimed for the full period of 100 days from the first day above mentioned, order and designate as the states and parts of states wherein the people thereof respectively are this day in rebellion against the United States, the following, to wit: Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, except the parishes of St. Bernard, Palquemines, Jefferson, St. John, St. Charles, St. James, Ascension, Assumption, Terrebonne, Lafourche, St. Mary, St. Martin, and Orleans, including the city of New Orleans, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, except the 48 counties designated as West Virginia, and also the counties of Berkeley, Accomack, Northampton, Elizabeth City, York, Princess Anne, and Norfolk, including the cities of Norfolk and Portsmouth, and which accepted parts are for the present left precisely as if this proclamation were not issued. And by virtue of the power and for the purpose aforesaid, I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated states and parts of states are, and henceforth shall be, free, and that the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authorities thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of said persons. And I hereby enjoin upon the people so declared to be free to abstain from all violence, unless in necessary self-defense. And I recommend to them that in all case, when allowed, they labor faithfully for reasonable wages. And I further declare and make known that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States to garrison forts, positions, stations, and other places, and to man vessels of all sorts in said service. And upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice, warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity, I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God.
I wanted to set in a little bit of context why I'm a part of this distinguished panel. And I think it is primarily because I represent an institution that is clearly Lincoln's legacy. The Howard University was established just 2 years after the end of the Civil War. There was a debate going on while Lincoln was still alive about what happens post-emancipation. There had already been a great deal of debate. As Congressman Jackson mentioned, there were some who thought about colonization as an issue. Lincoln himself wrestled with that. Lincoln talked about compensation of slave owners and then what should be done with the sons and daughters of these freed slaves. But it was very clear that education was going to play a vital role in their future. And so Frederick Douglass lobbied very hard for educational institutions, and of course the leader of an agency that Lincoln was greatly involved in, that is the Freedmen's Bureau. That leader, Oliver Otis Howard, was one who took the lead in working to establish the institution which eventually bore his name. So I am pleased that Howard University, which emerged from the Emancipation period, can be involved in this program. Lincoln, there's some question, obviously, about whether Lincoln was pushed or forced, as one Illinois historian has said, forced into the emancipation, or whether this was something done with cleverness, with skill, with clear foresight. And I believe it was the latter. Because I think that one of the things that's important to note about Lincoln, first and foremost, is that he was a lawyer. He acted in many ways as a lawyer would in addressing this problem and looking at it from many sides. He was not only working as a politician and trying to hold a coalition, but as Congressman Butterfield recognized, there were significant legal questions at stake here about exactly what power Lincoln had on emancipation. Some say that Lincoln was kind of the great leader, not only of North America, but Latin America, in terms of his actions in freeing slaves. There are clearly more slaves in South America than there were in the United States at that time. But the record does show that at the time of the U.S. Civil War, the legal institutions of slavery had been eliminated throughout Latin America, with only Cuba and Brazil still having legal slavery at the time of our Civil War. So Lincoln really didn't lead in that way. There had already been action taken by others, but Lincoln did stand as an inspiration to many people, and one though I talk about a lot in terms of Lincoln's inspiration for others who were fighting for a struggle for freedom, was a man named Jose Marti. Marti was an outstanding writer. He was a poet. He was a clear Renaissance man, but he was also an activist and a revolutionary. And Marti, as you know, became the great symbol for the liberation, for independence for Cuba, and is still to this day revered in Cuba. But Marti wrote a great deal about Abraham Lincoln. He was so inspired by the man and his work that throughout his commentary on liberation for Cuba, he went back and back to his references of Abraham Lincoln. So Lincoln did have a tremendous impact on the work of others, not only here but abroad. And clearly the impact of the Emancipation Proclamation had an impact on foreign powers. It is argued, and I know Dr. Franklin argued in his work, that because of the Emancipation Proclamation, European powers did not come in to recognize the Confederacy and support the Confederacy. Some debate about that, but since that's Dr. Franklin's thesis, I'll accept it. I also want to just touch upon this whole question about war powers. There was a great deal of debate, as has been mentioned, about the legal authority of the president to do what he did. There has always been, throughout our history, that discussion. I look back at some of the other questions from the time of the Alien and Sedition Acts in the 1790s up until President Roosevelt's action in his executive order in which he ordered the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. This debate about the extent of the president's power as commander-in-chief to take actions affecting people domestically. The Emancipation Proclamation is clearly a part of that debate. The Constitution says that it is the Congress that declares wars, but then what happens during the course of wars? What is the role of the commander-in-chief? How far may that commander-in-chief go? Well, Lincoln, I think, put on his lawyer's hat while he was in the White House, debated those questions, took his time, sorted through the constitutional issues, recognized that there would be a challenge, and also recognized that he had, at the time, a hostile Chief Justice of the Supreme Court who would probably, if given the chance, overturn an action of the president, but sorted through all that as the great lawyer he was and came out with a document that not only changed everything, in the words of Frederick Douglass, it changed everything in the 1860s. It led to the change for the better for the entire country that still resonates to this day. Thank you.
Frederick Douglass, a runaway slave from Maryland, became one of America's greatest abolitionist leaders. Douglass was a truly inspirational and powerful speaker who strongly supported racial pride and fought against oppression of all kinds. An advisor to United States presidents beginning with Abraham Lincoln, Douglass's impassioned writing and intellectual honesty won over audiences across the United States and in Europe. The legacy of his written and spoken words will inspire Americans today and into the future. No people are more talked about, and no people seem more imperfectly understood. those who see us every day seem not to know us. There is no Negro problem. The problem is whether the American people have loyalty enough, honor enough, patriotism enough to live up to their own Constitution.
For the nearly 4 million slaves, the Emancipation Proclamation was a symbol of hope. It confirmed their belief that the war should always have been a war for the, not to preserve the Union, but a war to free the slaves.
What you're seeing is really rare. It's always in a housing, but it's in process of being prepared for the 150th anniversary exhibit. Because it's a double-sided document, we can't show all pages at once. When it does go on exhibit, we alternate pages in order to limit light exposure. We know that it's light damaged. In order to preserve it for the future, we significantly limit the light exposure to just a couple of days, a few days a year.
The final proclamation didn't free any single slave immediately, only applied to the Confederate States, where the federal government didn't have the authority to enforce the law. What it did do, it brought a moral cost to the war.
The Emancipation Proclamation was written on a machine-made paper, which is typical of the Industrial Revolution. It was just 2 pieces of paper that were put together and folded in half. The piece of paper folded in half is called a folio. And so now we have 8 sides to write on. Holes were punched near the fold on the left margin, and through these holes they threaded ribbon. At some time in their past, they were taken apart. A very similar document is the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which was signed in September 1862. This one is still intact. The ribbon comes back through almost before the last page and then is secured by the presidential seal.
Last year, when the Emancipation Proclamation was on display at the Henry Ford Museum, thousands of people came to see the document, and the museum stayed open for 36 hours. People waited throughout the night to see the document.
Here comes the freedom train, you'd better hurry down.
In 1947, the Emancipation Proclamation was shown all across the country.
Inside the freedom train, you'll find a precious frame.
One individual who viewed the Emancipation Proclamation was Sally Ficklin, 88 years old. She was 4 years old at the time that the document was issued. She was one of the few formerly enslaved persons who viewed the document.
Behind the original is a little piece of paper with an alkaline reserve in it. If the document or the media generates any kind of acid, then they will migrate to the alkaline material. Okay, so now I'm just going to sandwich the document between 2 pieces of mylar, which is inert, and this will add a significant layer of protection, both from handling and dimensional support. So I'll seal all 4 sides, which will create the encapsulation, and that makes a micro environment in here. So this is the frame that the document lives in year-round. And then that frame is boxed, so it's technically in dark storage for almost most of the year.
While the Emancipation Proclamation didn't end slavery, it did pave the way for the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which ultimately abolished slavery in the country. It ranks up with the Declaration of Independence and other documents, important documents in U.S. history.
Interpreting Lincoln's life and work is extremely important. Recently, there have been questions raised as to whether Lincoln should be credited with freeing the slaves. The arguments go, given some of Lincoln's history, his racial attitudes and statements, his moderate views on the subject, his non-interference with slavery where it already existed, his once proposed solution of colonization, his gradualist approach to ending the institution, his hesitancy with respect to issuing the Emancipation Proclamation and using colored troops in the war, his late conversions to limited voting rights for blacks, and more, why should he be credited with freeing the slaves? Some have even argued that it was the various actions taken by the slaves themselves, and I participated for the last several months in a number of panels across the country where others have argued that self-emancipation was in fact the factor in moving Lincoln towards emancipation, including the power given to the Union cause as a result of the moral case for overturning slavery, plus the actual military role of working and fighting in Union campaigns that actually freed them. By forcing the issue of emancipation onto the agenda, first of military officers, then of Congress, and finally of Lincoln, it was the actions of the slaves themselves that led to freedom. Well, clearly, just as Congress and Lyndon Johnson would not have been able to pass and sign the civil rights and social legislation of the 60s apart from the modern and human rights movements, so too the military commanders, the Congress, and Lincoln would not have been able to achieve what they did without the agitation of the movement of slaves and their allies, including John Brown. On the other hand, the slaves would not have become freedmen apart from what these leaders did either. Because historical interpretation has played up the role of white male leaders while downplaying the role of mass movements and leaders of color and women, our understanding of history has been skewed. Some of the current put-down of traditional historical interpretation is legitimate rejection and reaction to this past, limited and distorted understanding and interpretation of our history. The search now, it seems to me, as I was invited to participate in this panel discussion, should be for a more balanced interpretation, which includes striving to put many forces and multiple players in proper balance and perspective. That, I think, is what is at issue with regard to the question, did Lincoln free the slaves? To answer this question, James McPherson says in Drawn with the Sword that we must first ask what was the essential condition, the one thing without which it would not have happened. The clear answer is the war. Slavery had existed for nearly 2.5 centuries. It was more deeply entrenched in the South than ever, and every effort at self-emancipation, and there were plenty, including the Underground Railroad, many of them had failed. Without the Civil War, there would not have been a Confiscation Act, no Emancipation Proclamation, no 13th Amendment, not to mention a 14th or 15th Amendment, and almost certainly no end to slavery for several more decades at least. Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president, was able to accomplish what 15 presidents before him had failed to do. As to the first question, what brought on the war? There are two interrelated answers. What brought on the war was slavery. What triggered the war was disunion over the issue of slavery. Disunion resulted because initially 7 and ultimately 11 Southern states saw Lincoln as an anti-slavery advocate and candidate, running on an anti-slavery party and an anti-slavery platform who would be an anti-slavery president. Rather than abide by such a, and I quote, black president and black Republican Party, Southern states led by the Democratic Party severed their ties to the Union. Through secession, which Lincoln and the Union refused to accept, they went to war over preserving the Union. And while Lincoln was willing to allow slavery to stand where it stood from 1854 when he entered politics onward, Lincoln never wavered or compromised on one central issue, the extension of slavery into the territories. And while gradualist in approach, Lincoln and the slave states of the South knew this would eventually mean the end of slavery. It was Lincoln who brought out and sustained all of these factors. Thus, while Lincoln's primary emphasis throughout was on saving the Union, the result of saving the Union was emancipation for the slaves. If the Union had not been preserved, slavery would not have been ended and may have even been strengthened. Strategically, Lincoln understood that the Union was a common ground issue around which he could rally the American people, while slavery and anti-slavery issues were divisive. And looked at in perspective, By holding this coalition together around the issue of union, enough Unionists eventually saw the connection between the two issues that he could ease into emancipation in the middle of the war while giving the North a huge boost. Even when Lincoln believed he was going to lose the presidency in 1864, he said, and I quote, "There have been men who proposed to me to return to slavery the black warriors who had fought for the Union. Quote, I should be damned in time and eternity for doing so. The world shall know that I will keep my faith to my friends and enemies, come what will." In effect, he was saying he would rather be right than president. As matters turned out, he was both right and president. Clearly, many slaves did self-emancipate through the Underground Railroad before the war and through fighting during the war. Even so, this is not the same as bringing an end to the peculiar institution of slavery, which only the Civil War and Lincoln's leadership did. By pronouncing slavery a moral evil that must come to an end and winning the presidency in 1860, provoking the South to succeed, by refusing to compromise on the issue of slavery's expansion or on Fort Sumter, by careful leadership and timing that kept a fragile Unionist coalition together in the first year of the war and committed it to emancipation in the second, by refusing to compromise this policy once he had adopted it, real presidential leadership, and by prosecuting the war to unconditional victory as commander-in-chief of an army of liberation, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. I thought it particularly important to put the life of Lincoln in 1863 in a broader context than just, did he free the slaves or did he not? The magnificent presidency of our 16th president was about managing a number of forces that came together to create a climate to bring about the idea of emancipation. Given the politics of the South, given the politics of those pro-slavery states that chose to stay in the Union and remain part of Abraham Lincoln's coalition, along with those states that chose to stay in the Union where there was no slavery, Lincoln's balancing act in the midterm congressional elections after his presidency was about making sure that pro-slavery but pro-Union states would not find themselves joining the Southern coalition. And at the appropriate time, at the right moment, Abraham Lincoln pulled the trigger and set the climate for an enormous moral as well as military victory for the Union.
While the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect in 1863, there were areas still under heavy Confederate control who refused to honor the terms of the Emancipation Proclamation. It would not be until June 19th of 1865 when 2,000 Union troops would arrive in Galveston Bay, Texas, to emancipate more than 250,000 enslaved black people. The name Juneteenth, or June 19th, was adopted to commemorate this historic occasion. There is, of course, a common myth that the slaves did not know they were free. They absolutely did know they were free. However, the horrific conditions of torture and degradation continued, forcing many to choose living over torture or death. It is documented that as late as October of 1865, some Texans still owned slaves, and a report by the Texas Constitutional Convention cited that between the years 1865 and 1868, which was after the Emancipation Proclamation, almost 400 black people were killed.